February 23, 1945. Dawn breaks over a small volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean. The air is thick with smoke, sulfur, and the metallic scent of blood. On a blackened beach littered with destroyed landing craft and fallen Marines, 19-year-old Private First Class Ira Hayes crouches in a shell crater, his hands trembling as he grips his rifle. Above him looms Mount Suribachi, a 556-foot volcanic mountain that has become a fortress of death. From its caves and tunnels, Japanese soldiers have unleashed hell upon the American invasion force for 4 brutal days. Every yard of black volcanic sand has been paid for in marine blood. Thousands of young men, most barely old enough to vote, lie dead or wounded on beaches that have been transformed into killing fields. But today, something is about to change. Today, a small group of teenagers carrying rifles and a folded American flag will climb into legend. Today, they will do what military strategists said would take weeks, if it could be done at all. This is the story of how 19-year-old Marines took Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi. The story of boys who became men in the span of hours. The story of one of the most iconic moments in American military history, and the terrible price paid to create it. The photograph you've seen 1,000 times, 6 men raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, represents just one frozen moment. But behind that image lies a story of courage, fear, sacrifice, and the raw determination of young men who had no idea they were about to become immortal. To understand what happened on that mountain, we must first understand why this tiny island mattered so much that America was willing to sacrifice thousands of its sons to take it. Iwo Jima. The name means Sulfur Island in Japanese. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, black sand beaches, and almost no vegetation. No fresh water, no natural resources, no civilian population. By any measure, it was one of the most inhospitable pieces of land in the Pacific Ocean. Yet by early 1945, this miserable island had become strategically vital to both sides in the Pacific War. For the Americans, Iwo Jima represented the key to bringing the war to the Japanese homeland. American B-29 Superfortress bombers were conducting increasingly devastating raids on Japanese cities, flying from bases in the Mariana Islands. But the round-trip journey was over 3,000 miles, at the absolute limit of the B-29's range. Damaged bombers often couldn't make it home. Crews ditched in the ocean or crash-landed, and many were lost. Iwo Jima sat almost exactly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. If America could capture it, the island's airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for damaged bombers and as bases for fighter escorts that could protect the B-29s all the way to their targets. Military planners estimated that capturing Iwo Jima would save thousands of American airmen's lives and dramatically increase the bombing campaign. For the Japanese, Iwo Jima was the first piece of the Japanese homeland that America was attempting to invade. The island was technically part of the Tokyo Prefecture, Japanese soil proper, not a conquered territory. Losing it would be a devastating psychological blow and would bring American forces to Japan's doorstep. The Japanese commander assigned to defend Iwo Jima was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a brilliant and unconventional officer who had spent time in America before the war and understood his enemy better than most Japanese commanders. He knew that he couldn't defeat the American invasion. The U.S. had overwhelming superiority in ships, planes, and manpower. But he could make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they would think twice before attempting to invade Japan itself. Kuribayashi spent months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress unlike anything the Americans had encountered in the Pacific War. He abandoned the traditional Japanese defensive strategy of meeting invaders at the beach. Instead, he ordered his 21,000 troops to dig, to create an underground fortress of tunnels, caves, and fortified positions. Miles of tunnels were carved into the volcanic rock, connecting hundreds of defensive positions. Every cave entrance was carefully positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Artillery pieces were mounted in caves that could be sealed with steel doors. The entire island became a trap, designed to bleed the Americans white. At the southern tip of the island stood Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano that dominated the landscape. Kuribayashi turned it into the cornerstone of his defense. The mountain was honeycombed with tunnels and fortified positions. Artillery and machine gun nests were positioned to cover every approach. From its summit, Japanese observers had a perfect view of the invasion beaches and could direct fire on any American movement. Taking Mount Suribachi would be essential to securing the beachhead. But Kuribayashi intended to make it cost more than the Americans could bear. February 19, 1945. D-Day for Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima. At 0900 hours, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. They came in amphibious tractors, crossing the line of departure and heading toward the black sand beaches at the base of Mount Suribachi. Most of these Marines were young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Many had never seen combat before. They had been told that the pre-invasion bombardment, 3 days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing, had softened up the Japanese defenses. They were wrong. The first Marines to reach the beach encountered an obstacle they hadn't anticipated. The volcanic sand, composed of tiny particles of volcanic ash, provided almost no traction. Men sank up to their ankles with every step. Vehicles bogged down. The carefully planned advance inland stalled as Marines struggled simply to move through the sand. Then the Japanese opened fire. General Kuribayashi had ordered his troops to hold their fire until the beaches were packed with Marines and equipment. Now, from hundreds of hidden positions, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns unleashed a devastating barrage. The beaches erupted in explosions. Marines were cut down by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Landing craft were destroyed before they could even discharge their troops. The surf turned red with blood. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas, just 17 years old, he had lied about his age to enlist, hit the beach with the first wave. Years later, he would recall the chaos. All around me, men were screaming, dying. I saw a Marine get hit and just disappear, blown apart by a shell. I was so scared I could barely move, but I kept going because everyone else kept going. On the left flank of the invasion, closest to Mount Suribachi, the 28th Marine Regiment fought to establish a foothold. Their objective was to cut across the narrow neck of the island, isolating Mount Suribachi from the rest of Iwo Jima's defenders, then to take the mountain itself. The regiment's commander, Colonel Harry "the Horse" Liversedge, was a veteran officer who had seen combat in World War I and throughout the Pacific Campaign. But nothing had prepared him for the intensity of the fighting on Iwo Jima. Within hours of the landing, his regiment had suffered hundreds of casualties. Medical corpsmen worked frantically on the beach, trying to save the wounded while shells continued to fall around them. Among the Marines pinned down on that beach was 19-year-old Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona. Hayes had enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1942, driven by a desire to serve his country and escape the poverty of the reservation. He had trained as a parachutist, but had been transferred to a regular Marine rifle company before deploying to the Pacific. Now, on his first day of combat, he found himself in hell. Also on that beach was Rene Gagnon, 19, a mill worker from New Hampshire. Franklin Sousley, 19, a farm boy from Kentucky. Harlon Block, 20, from Texas. John Bradley, 21, a Navy corpsman from Wisconsin. Michael Strank, 25, a Marine sergeant from Pennsylvania who had been born in Czechoslovakia and spoke with a slight accent. These young men, and thousands like them, would spend 4 days and nights fighting for every yard of ground between the beach and Mount Suribachi. They would watch friends die, drag wounded comrades to safety, and discover reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. By February 21st, the 28th Marines had fought their way across the narrow neck of Iwo Jima, cutting off Mount Suribachi from the rest of the island. But the mountain itself remained in Japanese hands, and its defenders showed no signs of surrendering. Colonel Liversedge knew that his Marines were exhausted. They had been in continuous combat for 3 days with little sleep, inadequate food, and constant exposure to enemy fire. Casualties had been devastating. The regiment had lost nearly a third of its strength. But the mountain had to be taken. Every hour it remained in Japanese hands, American Marines died on the beaches below. The plan was simple in concept, but nightmarish in execution. The 28th Marines would assault the mountain from multiple directions, systematically clearing the Japanese defenders from the hundreds of caves and fortified positions that covered its slopes. It would be close-quarters combat of the most brutal kind. Grenades thrown into cave mouths, flamethrowers burning out defenders, hand-to-hand fighting in the darkness. If you're enjoying this journey through history, remember to subscribe to WW2 Last Stand, where we bring forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands of World War II back to life. The assault on Mount Suribachi began on February 22nd. Marines advanced up the slopes in small groups, supporting each other, using every rock and depression for cover. Japanese defenders fired from caves and pillboxes, often waiting until Marines were just yards away before opening up with machine guns. The fighting was savage. Marines used pole charges, explosives attached to long poles, to destroy fortified positions. They threw satchel charges into cave entrances, sealed openings with demolitions, and burned defenders out with flamethrowers. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the ever-present odor of sulfur. 19-year-old Private First Class Donald Rule was advancing with his squad when a Japanese grenade landed among them. Without hesitation, Rule threw himself on the grenade, absorbing the blast with his own body. He died instantly, but his sacrifice saved the lives of his fellow Marines. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The Marines' advance was measured in yards per hour. The mountain slopes were steep and covered with loose volcanic ash that made footing treacherous. Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing they were doomed but determined to take as many Americans with them as possible. By nightfall on February 22nd, the Marines had fought their way nearly to the summit, but the mountain was not yet secure. Throughout the night, Japanese soldiers attempted to infiltrate Marine positions. Sentries stayed alert, knowing that falling asleep could mean death for themselves and their comrades. Sergeant Michael Strank, the Czechoslovakian immigrant who led a squad in Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, moved among his young Marines throughout the night, checking on them, encouraging them, making sure they stayed alert. At 25, he was older than most of the men he led, ancient by the standards of a rifle company. His Marines called him Mike and trusted him completely. He had kept them alive through 3 days of hell, and they believed he would see them through whatever came next. As dawn broke on February 23rd, Colonel Liversedge gave the order for a combat patrol to reach the summit and secure it. If possible, they were to raise the American flag, a symbolic gesture, but one that would mean everything to the thousands of Marines still fighting on the beaches below. Lieutenant Harold Schreier, a platoon commander in Easy Company, was given command of the 40-man patrol tasked with reaching the summit. Among the Marines selected for the patrol were Sergeant Michael Strank and several members of his squad, including Ira Hayes, Franklin Sousley, and Harlon Block. Before they left, the battalion adjutant gave Schreier an American flag, a small one, measuring 54 by 28 inches, taken from a ship offshore. "If you get to the top," he told Schreier, "put it up." The patrol began its climb at 800 hours on February 23rd. The Marines moved cautiously, expecting Japanese fire at any moment. But the slopes were eerily quiet. The intensity of the previous day's fighting seemed to have broken the back of the mountain's defense. Still, danger lurked everywhere. The mountain was riddled with caves and tunnels, and Japanese soldiers could emerge at any moment. The Marines advanced with weapons ready, nerves stretched taut, expecting every second to be their last. Private First Class James Robeson, just 19 years old, later recalled, "We kept waiting for all hell to break loose. Every step we took, we expected machine gun fire or grenades. But it stayed quiet, and that almost made it worse. The waiting was torture." As they climbed higher, the panorama of the battle spread out below them. They could see the invasion beaches packed with men and equipment, the ocean filled with hundreds of American ships, and the rest of Iwo Jima stretching away to the north where fighting still raged. The scale of the invasion was staggering, and for a moment these young Marines understood that they were part of something vastly larger than themselves. At 10:20 hours, Lieutenant Schreier and his patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They found the crater at the top, a depression formed by the ancient volcano, and quickly secured the immediate area. A few Japanese soldiers were found in caves and killed or captured, but there was no organized resistance. Schreier ordered his Marines to find something to use as a flagpole. They located a long piece of pipe, probably part of a Japanese water system, and attached the flag to it. At 10:37 hours, 4 days, 1 hour, and 37 minutes after the first Marines hit the beach, the American flag was raised over Mount Suribachi. On the beaches below, Marines saw the flag go up and erupted in cheers. Men who had been pinned down by enemy fire for days, who had watched friends die, who had begun to wonder if they would ever leave this cursed island alive, suddenly felt hope. The sight of that flag, small as it was, meant they had achieved something. The mountain that had killed so many of their brothers was now in American hands. Ships offshore sounded their horns and sirens. The sound carried across the island, a celebration of courage and sacrifice, a moment of triumph in the midst of ongoing horror. But the story of how 19-year-old Marines took Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi was far from over. In fact, the moment that would define this battle for generations was yet to come. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, observing the battle from offshore, saw the first flag go up and was deeply moved. He turned to General Holland "Howling Mad" Smith, the overall commander of Marine forces, and said, "Holland, the raising of that flag means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." Forrestal wanted that flag as a souvenir. But Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, the commander of 2nd Battalion 28th Marines, had other ideas. That flag belonged to the battalion. If the Navy Secretary wanted a flag, he could have a different one. Johnson ordered a larger flag, 96 by 56 inches, to be taken to the summit and raised in place of the first one. The larger flag would be more visible to the Marines still fighting across the island. And, perhaps more importantly, it would ensure that the first flag could be preserved as a battalion trophy. A second patrol was organized to carry the larger flag to the summit. This patrol included Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlon Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Private First Class Rene Gagnon, who carried the flag, and Navy corpsman John Bradley. These men made the climb to the summit not knowing that a photographer named Joe Rosenthal from the Associated Press had also made his way to the top, looking for a good shot of the first flag. Rosenthal almost missed the second flag raising entirely. He had been photographing Marines elsewhere on the summit when someone called out that they were putting up another flag. What happened next took about 4 seconds and would become the most reproduced photograph in history. The 6 men, Strank, Block, Sousley, Hayes, Gagnon, and Bradley, along with Navy corpsman John Bradley, worked together to raise the heavy flagpole. The pipe was longer and heavier than the first one, and the wind caught the large flag, making the task more difficult. As they pushed the pole upward, straining against its weight and the wind, Joe Rosenthal squeezed his camera's shutter. Click. In that fraction of a second, 6 young men were transformed into icons. The photograph captured something essential about the American spirit. Ordinary men working together to achieve something difficult. Their bodies straining in unison, the flag beginning to rise against the sky. The composition was perfect, almost impossibly so. The image contained drama, determination, and hope. But here's what the photograph didn't show: the bodies of Marines still lying on the beaches below. The wounded were screaming in aid stations. The Japanese soldiers are still fighting in caves across the island. The fact that 3 of the 6 men in the photograph, Strank, Block, and Sousley, would be dead within days, killed in the continuing battle for Iwo Jima. The photograph also didn't show who these men really were. Ira Hayes, the Pima Indian who would struggle with survivor's guilt and alcoholism for the rest of his short life, dying at age 32. Rene Gagnon, the mill worker who never quite understood why he was famous. John Bradley, the Navy corpsman who rarely spoke about the war and never considered himself a hero. Franklin Sousley, the farm boy who wrote letters home about how much he missed Kentucky and his mother, not knowing he would never see her again. Harlon Block, initially misidentified in the photo as another Marine, leaving his family in limbo about whether their son was one of the famous flag raisers. Michael Strank, the immigrant sergeant who had taken care of his young Marines right up until the moment a shell killed him. These were not superhuman warriors. They were teenagers and young men doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive and help their friends survive. The flag raising was not a moment of glory for them. It was just another task in a day full of dangerous tasks. But for the millions of Americans who saw Rosenthal's photograph when it was published days later, it became something more. It became a symbol of American determination, of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things, of ultimate victory that was now clearly in sight after years of brutal war. The raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi occurred on the 5th day of the Battle for Iwo Jima. The battle would continue for another 31 days. The fighting that followed the capture of Suribachi was even more brutal than what had come before. General Kuribayashi's main defensive positions were in the northern part of the island, where the terrain was even more favorable to defense and the fortifications even more elaborate. Marines advanced yard by yard through a moonscape of shell craters, destroyed pillboxes, and the bodies of the dead. They cleared caves with grenades and flamethrowers. They fought in close-quarters combat where the enemy was often invisible until the moment he opened fire. The volcanic rock amplified every explosion, turning artillery barrages into earthquakes. Of the 6 men who raised the second flag on Suribachi, 3 were killed in the weeks that followed. Sergeant Michael Strank died on March 1st, killed by friendly fire when an American mortar shell landed short. Harlon Block died on the same day, killed by a mortar round. Franklin Sousley died on March 21st, shot by a Japanese sniper just days before the island was declared secure. The 3 survivors, Ira Hayes, Rene Gagnon, and John Bradley, were pulled off the island and sent back to the United States for a war bond tour. The American government, recognizing the propaganda value of Rosenthal's photograph, wanted to use the flag raisers to help sell war bonds and maintain public support for the war effort. These 3 young men suddenly found themselves famous, celebrated as heroes, paraded before crowds and cameras. But they didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors who had gotten lucky while their friends had died. The adulation made them uncomfortable. The questions about the flag raising seemed to trivialize everything else that had happened on that terrible island. By the time the Battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, the casualties were staggering. Of the approximately 70,000 Marines who participated in the invasion, nearly 27,000 became casualties, over 6,800 killed, and nearly 20,000 wounded. The casualty rate exceeded 35%, making Iwo Jima one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The Japanese defenders fought almost to the last man. Of the 21,000 Japanese troops on the island, only about 200 were captured. The rest died in the tunnels and caves they had spent months preparing, fulfilling General Kuribayashi's promise to make the Americans pay dearly for every foot of ground. Was it worth it? Military historians still debate this question. The island did serve as an emergency landing strip for B-29s. Over 2,400 emergency landings were made on Iwo Jima during the remainder of the war, potentially saving thousands of airmen's lives. The fighter escorts based on Iwo Jima did help protect the bombers attacking Japan. But the price, nearly 7,000 American dead, was devastating. What's not debatable is the courage of the young Marines who fought there. Most were teenagers. Most had never seen combat before. Yet they faced the most brutal fighting conditions imaginable and kept going. They watched friends die and kept going. They were terrified and kept going. The 19-year-old Marines who took Mount Suribachi were not different from any other generation of young people. They didn't have special training that made them immune to fear. They weren't naturally more courageous than the teenagers of today. What they had was a sense of duty, a bond with the men beside them, and the conviction that what they were doing mattered. Stand on the summit of Mount Suribachi today, and it's hard to imagine the hell that unfolded here 80 years ago. The black sand beaches are peaceful now. The caves that once held Japanese defenders are empty. The volcanic rock, once churned by explosions, has settled into stillness. But if you listen carefully, or perhaps if you just imagine hard enough, you can almost hear the echoes. The sound of landing craft hitting the beach, the crack of rifle fire, the screams of wounded men calling for corpsmen, the cheers that erupted when the flag was raised, the voices of 19-year-old boys who became men on this island, and the silence of those who never had the chance to become anything more. The story of how 19-year-old Marines took Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi is ultimately a story about youth facing unimaginable challenges and rising to meet them. It's about ordinary people, mill workers and farmers, Native Americans and immigrants, high school athletes and factory workers, discovering extraordinary courage within themselves. It's also a story about the cost of war. The 6 men in Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph represent thousands of others who fought on Iwo Jima. 3 of them died before the battle ended. The 3 who survived carried the weight of that survival for the rest of their lives. They never asked to be heroes, they just did their jobs, and history transformed them into symbols. Ira Hayes, haunted by survivor's guilt and unable to reconcile his fame with the deaths of his friends, struggled with alcoholism and died in 1955 at age 32. John Bradley almost never spoke about Iwo Jima or the flag raising, wanting to be remembered for his life after the war rather than for 4 seconds on a mountaintop. Rene Gagnon worked various jobs throughout his life, never quite finding his place, dying of a heart attack at age 54. They were not superhuman. They were young men who found themselves in circumstances they never could have imagined and did what they had to do. That's the real lesson of Iwo Jima. Not that some people are naturally heroic, but that ordinary people can rise to extraordinary circumstances when they must. We study battles like Iwo Jima not to glorify war, but to honor the sacrifice of those who fought, to remember that freedom has always required defenders, to understand that the world we live in today was shaped by the courage of young people who were willing to risk everything for a cause larger than themselves. The next time you see that famous photograph, and you will see it because it's become one of the most iconic images in American history, remember that it shows just one moment in a 36-day battle. Remember the 19-year-olds who climbed that mountain while machine guns fired at them. Remember the medics who ran into enemy fire to save the wounded. Remember the thousands who never came home. And remember that those young Marines didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as men doing their duty, standing by their friends, serving their country. The fact that we remember them as heroes says more about the magnitude of their accomplishment than any words ever could. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Mount Suribachi. If you want to explore more forgotten battles, untold stories, and the final stands that shaped our world, make sure to watch our other videos here at WW2 Last Stand. Subscribe to continue uncovering the moments of courage and sacrifice that changed history forever. Remember their sacrifice. Honor their memory. Never forget.